A court of broken oaths. Francesca Barone had always been careful, controlled. But the night she let the wrong man kiss her, let him touch her, she made the kind of mistake that could set the city on fire. Because he was Lorenzo De Luca, the enemy. And now, when she stood at her father's side, preparing for war, she felt his gaze settle on her like a brand. "You shouldn't have kissed me," he murmured, his voice dark with something unspoken. "Because now I won't stop until you belong to me." Chapter 1. The Shadow of Unspoken Promises. The air in the grand ballroom of the Barone estate was thick with the scent of lilies and the low hum of hushed conversations. Francesca Barone moved through the throng of guests with a practiced grace, her emerald gown shimmering under the light of the crystal chandeliers. 58 years, and she still carried herself with the regal bearing of a woman born into one of New York's oldest mafia families. But tonight, the familiar comfort of her position felt like a gilded cage. Her father, Don Antonio Barone, stood near the marble fireplace, his silver hair gleaming, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He was a man of few words, but his presence radiated power. Beside him stood her brother, Marco, his dark suit and intense gaze mirroring their father's authority. They were discussing the upcoming arrangement with the Rossi family, a business deal, coded in the polite language of old money and older traditions, but Francesca knew the truth. It was a power play, a delicate dance on the edge of a knife. She caught Marco's eye, and he gave her a curt nod, a silent command to join them. As she approached, she could hear the low rumble of her father's voice. The De Lucas are getting bolder. They're testing the boundaries. The De Lucas. The name sent a shiver down her spine, a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the family rivalry and everything to do with him. Lorenzo De Luca. Just the memory of his name brought the ghost of his touch to her skin. The night of the charity gala, a neutral ground where the families mingled under the pretense of philanthropy. She'd been cornered by a particularly persistent suitor, a man her father favored, when Lorenzo had appeared. Tall, dark, with eyes that seemed to hold both the storm and the calm. He'd swept in, claiming her for a dance with a possessiveness that had both thrilled and terrified her. She'd known it was wrong, dangerous. But for a few stolen moments, she'd allowed herself to forget the decades of animosity, the blood feud that separated their families. He'd held her close, his hand warm on the small of her back, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. The scent of him sandalwood, and something darker, something wild had filled her senses. And then he'd kissed her. Not a chaste peck, but a slow, deliberate claiming of her mouth, a promise of something more. A promise that had haunted her ever since. "Francesca," her father's voice cut through her reverie, sharp and demanding. "You're quiet tonight." She forced a smile. "Just thinking, Papa." "About the Rossi deal?" Marco interjected, his tone probing. "About the future," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "About what it holds for all of us." Antonio studied her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. "The future is what we make it, Francesca. It is built on loyalty, on strength, on adherence to the traditions that have kept us safe for generations." His words were a reminder, a warning. She was a Barone. Her duty was to her family, to their legacy. There was no room for personal desires, for foolish fantasies spun from a stolen kiss. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Francesca found herself on the balcony, overlooking the sprawling gardens. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a vast, indifferent backdrop to the carefully constructed world she inhabited. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, trying to shake off the lingering unease. But the memory of Lorenzo's kiss, the feel of his lips on hers, was branded into her memory. She could almost feel the phantom pressure of his hand on her waist, the way he'd looked at her, as if she were something precious, something to be possessed. A soft sound, a rustle of fabric, made her turn. He was there, standing in the shadows, a figure both familiar and forbidden. Lorenzo De Luca. He hadn't been invited, of course. His presence was a blatant transgression, a challenge to the unspoken rules that governed their lives. He stepped into the moonlight, and her breath caught in her throat. He was even more striking than she remembered, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his eyes intense and unreadable. He wore a dark suit that molded to his broad shoulders, emphasizing his powerful physique. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips. "And you shouldn't have kissed me." The words hung in the air between them, a charged silence that crackled with unspoken tension. He took a step closer, invading her personal space, and she instinctively recoiled. But there was nowhere to go. She was trapped between him and the wrought iron railing of the balcony. "That kiss," he continued, his voice a low murmur that sent shivers down her spine. "It changed things, Francesca. You know it did." She wanted to deny it, to tell him it meant nothing, that it was a mistake. But the lie wouldn't come. She had felt something. Something dangerous, something forbidden, something that had awakened a part of her she thought long dead. "It was a mistake," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate in the air around them. "Was it? Or was it the first honest moment you've allowed yourself in years?" His words struck a chord, a raw nerve deep within her. He saw too much, understood too much. It was unsettling, unnerving. "Stay away from me, Lorenzo," she said, trying to infuse her voice with a strength she didn't feel. "Stay away from my family." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "I can't," he said, his voice soft, yet laced with steel. "Not anymore. That kiss, it was a claim. And I always collect what's mine." His gaze locked with hers, a silent battle of wills. She knew she should push him away, scream for help, alert her father and brother to his presence. But she was frozen, caught in the magnetic pull of his gaze, the dangerous allure of the forbidden. The city lights seemed to blur, the sounds of the night fading into a distant hum. All that existed was him, the intensity of his presence, the unspoken promise in his eyes. A promise of war, and something far more dangerous. A promise of a love that could destroy them both. Chapter 2. Echoes of a Forbidden Kiss. The following days passed in a blur of strained normalcy. Francesca found herself going through the motions of her life: charity luncheons, meetings with a family lawyer, quiet evenings at home, but her mind was elsewhere. It was consumed by the memory of Lorenzo's words, his touch, the dangerous promise that hung in the air between them. She tried to push him from her thoughts, to focus on the impending alliance with the Rossi family. A marriage was being discussed between her cousin Isabella and the Rossi heir, Alessandro. It was a strategic move, a consolidation of power, but Francesca couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over her whenever the subject was broached. It felt like another cage, another gilded prison being built around the women of her family. One afternoon, she found herself in the family library, a vast, silent room lined with shelves of ancient books. The scent of old paper and leather was a familiar comfort, a refuge from the pressures of her life. She ran her fingers along the spines, searching for a distraction, when her gaze fell upon a worn leather-bound volume. It was a history of the Barone family, tracing their lineage back centuries, to their origins in Sicily. She pulled the book from the shelf and sat in a worn armchair near the window, letting the sunlight fall across the pages. As she turned the brittle pages, she saw photographs of her ancestors, stern-faced men and women who had built the family empire from nothing. She saw pictures of her mother, a beautiful woman with a sad smile, who had died when Francesca was young. And then, she saw a picture of her father, a younger version of himself, standing beside a man she recognized. It was Lorenzo De Luca's father, Giovanni. They were younger, their faces unlined by the years of conflict, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, smiling. It was a shocking image, a glimpse into a past she'd never known. A past where the Baroness and the De Lucas weren't enemies, but friends. Allies. She closed the book, her mind reeling. What had happened? What had caused the rift, the blood feud that had defined her life? The questions gnawed at her, a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. She knew her father wouldn't answer them. He kept the past locked away, a secret guarded by silence and unspoken threats. That evening, she found herself drawn to the garden, the same place where she'd encountered Lorenzo. The air was cool and crisp, the scent of roses heavy in the air. She walked along the gravel paths, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She wasn't surprised when she saw him. He was standing near the fountain, his back to her, his silhouette outlined against the shimmering water. He turned as she approached, his eyes dark and unreadable in the moonlight. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I shouldn't be here," she replied, echoing her words from their previous encounter. But this time, there was less conviction in her voice. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "But you are." He stepped closer, and she didn't retreat. The distance between them narrowed, the air crackling with unspoken tension. "I found something today," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A picture. Of our fathers. They were friends." His expression changed, a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or sadness crossing his features. "The past is a different country, Francesca. They do things differently there." "But what happened?" She persisted. "Why the hatred? Why the war?" He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "It's a long story. A story filled with betrayal, with blood, with mistakes that can never be undone." "Tell me," she said, her voice pleading. "I need to understand." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. She saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a glimpse of the man beneath the carefully constructed mask of the mafia prince. "It started with a woman," he said, his voice low and heavy. "A woman loved by both our fathers. A woman who chose my father and broke your father's heart." The words hung in the air, a revelation that shattered the carefully constructed narrative of her life. It was a story of love, of loss, of betrayal. A story that had shaped the destinies of their families for generations. "And that's it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "That's the reason for all this hatred?" He shook his head. "It was more than that. There were other things. Business deals gone wrong, accusations of treachery, a thirst for revenge that consumed them both." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, a gentle touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She was mesmerized by his touch, by the sadness in his eyes, by the weight of the history that bound them together. "We're not our fathers, Francesca," he said, his voice a soft whisper. "We don't have to repeat their mistakes." His words resonated with her, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Could they break the cycle of violence, of hatred? Could they forge a new path, a future free from the shadows of the past? She looked into his eyes, searching for an answer. And in that moment, she saw something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She saw a reflection of her own longing, her own desire for something more than the life she'd always known. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. It was a ghost of their first kiss, a reminder of the forbidden passion that simmered between them. But this time it was different. There was a tenderness, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the intoxicating sensation of his lips on hers. It was a kiss of longing, of regret, of hope. A kiss that whispered of a future that might be, a future where love could conquer hate, where the echoes of the past could finally be silenced. But even as she lost herself in the kiss, a small voice of doubt whispered in the back of her mind. A warning. This was dangerous. This was forbidden. This could destroy everything. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to pull away. The feeling was much too strong. Chapter 3. The Weight of Family Secrets. The kiss lingered, a fragile bubble of intimacy suspended in the dangerous reality of their world. When they finally parted, Francesca felt breathless, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cool night air raised goosebumps on her arms, a stark contrast to the heat that still lingered on her lips. Lorenzo's eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with a raw emotion that mirrored her own. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the curve of her lower lip, as if memorizing the feel of her. "This changes everything," he murmured, his voice husky. Francesca nodded, unable to speak. The weight of what they were doing, the potential consequences, crashed down on her. It wasn't just their lives at stake, it was the delicate balance of power between two families, a balance maintained by decades of animosity and carefully orchestrated alliances. "We need to be careful," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. Lorenzo's expression hardened, the vulnerability replaced by the familiar mask of the DeLuca heir. "Careful is my middle name," he said, a hint of dark humor in his tone. But she could see the underlying tension in the set of his jaw, the way his hand clenched into a fist at his side. He stepped back, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm that still separated them. "I have to go. My father, he expects me." Francesca nodded, understanding. The demands of family, the unspoken obligations, were a constant presence in their lives. They were both bound by duty, by loyalty, by the weight of generations of expectations. As Lorenzo turned to leave, she reached out, her hand catching his arm. "Lorenzo, what about the Rossi alliance? The marriage?" He paused, his back to her. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the unspoken conflict between his personal desires and his family obligations. "It's complicated," he said, his voice tight. "Alessandro Rossi is a good man. He would be a suitable match for Isabella. But," Francesca prompted, her heart sinking. He turned back to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and resignation. "But it strengthens the Rossi's position. And it weakens ours. My father, he sees it as a threat." Francesca understood. The alliance wasn't just about uniting two families, it was about shifting the balance of power, about creating new alliances and new enemies. And in their world, enemies were dealt with swiftly and brutally. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I won't let them use you, Francesca. Or Isabella. I won't let them sacrifice you on the altar of their ambitions." His words sent a shiver of hope through her. He was protecting her, even though it meant defying his own father, risking everything. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a silent promise of solidarity. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice firm. "Together." And in that moment, Francesca believed him. She believed in the possibility of a different future, a future where they could be together, despite the odds. After he left, Francesca returned to the house, her mind racing. She needed to talk to Isabella, to warn her about the potential dangers of the Rossi alliance. But she also knew that she couldn't reveal her relationship with Lorenzo. It was too risky, too dangerous. She found Isabella in her room, sitting at her dressing table, brushing her long, dark hair. Isabella was younger than Francesca, more naive, more sheltered. She still believed in fairy tales, in the possibility of true love and happily ever after. "Isabella," Francesca began, her voice hesitant. "About the Rossi marriage, are you happy about it?" Isabella turned, her eyes shining with excitement. "Of course, Francesca. Alessandro is so charming, so handsome. And the Rossi family, they're so powerful, so respected." Francesca's heart ached for her cousin. Isabella was walking into a trap, blinded by the glitter and glamour of the mafia world. "But do you love him?" Francesca asked, her voice gentle. Isabella hesitated, her smile faltering. "Love? I don't know. I barely know him. But Papa says it's a good match, that it's important for the family." Francesca sighed. It was the same old story. The women of the family were pawns in the men's games, their happiness sacrificed for the sake of power and prestige. "Isabella," she said, taking her cousin's hands in hers, "you have to be careful. The mafia world, it's not a fairy tale. It's dangerous. There are secrets, betrayals, things you can't even imagine." Isabella looked at her, her eyes wide with fear. What do you mean, Francesca? What secrets? Francesca hesitated. She couldn't tell her about Lorenzo, about the forbidden kiss, about the history between their families. It was too much, too soon. Just be careful, she repeated, her voice firm. Trust your instincts. And don't let anyone pressure you into doing something you don't want to do. Isabella nodded, her expression thoughtful. I will, Francesca. Thank you. Francesca hugged her cousin, a fierce wave of protectiveness washing over her. She would do everything in her power to protect Isabella, to shield her from the darkness that surrounded them. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she knew that she couldn't protect Isabella or herself from the storm that was brewing. The forbidden kiss had set events in motion, a chain reaction that could destroy everything they held dear. And she was caught in the middle, torn between her loyalty to her family and her growing feelings for the enemy. The weight of family secrets pressed down on her, a heavy burden that threatened to crush her. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the worst was yet to come. The quiet hum of the house seemed to amplify the silence in her own heart, a silence filled with a growing dread. Chapter 4. A Dance on the Edge of Darkness. The next few weeks were a delicate dance of deception and hidden desires. Francesca found herself caught in a web of lies, navigating the treacherous currents of family expectations while secretly meeting with Lorenzo. Their encounters were brief, stolen moments in the shadows, fueled by a growing passion that defied the boundaries of their warring families. They met in secluded gardens, in quiet corners of art galleries, in the back pews of empty churches. Each meeting was a risk, a gamble, but they couldn't stay away from each other. The pull was too strong, the connection too deep. Lorenzo told her more about the history between their families, the intricate web of betrayals and resentments that had led to the decades-long feud. He spoke of his father's bitterness, his unwavering hatred of the Baroness, and his determination to maintain the status quo. He sees you as a prize, Lorenzo said one evening, as they sat on a park bench, hidden beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. A symbol of his victory over my father. Francesca shivered, the cold reality of his words sinking in. She was a pawn in their game, a tool to be used and discarded. And what do you see me as? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that took her breath away. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek, a gentle touch that sent shivers down her spine. I see you, Francesca, he said, his voice husky. I see the woman beneath the Baron name. The woman who is strong and intelligent and passionate. The woman he hesitated, his gaze searching hers. The woman I'm falling in love with. His words hung in the air, a declaration that changed everything. Francesca's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and exhilaration washing over her. She was falling in love with him too, she realized. It was madness, it was dangerous, but it was undeniable. We can't, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's impossible. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a silent promise of solidarity. Nothing is impossible, Francesca. We'll find a way. We'll make them see. But making them see would be harder than they imagined. The Rossi alliance was moving forward, the marriage plans progressing rapidly. Isabella was caught up in the whirlwind of preparations, her initial excitement fading, replaced by a growing unease that mirrored Francesca's own. Francesca tried to talk to her father, to reason with him, but he was unyielding. He saw the alliance as a strategic necessity, a way to strengthen the family's position and secure their future. You're being sentimental, Francesca, he said, his voice cold and dismissive. This is not about love, it's about power. It's about survival. Francesca knew he was right in a way. The mafia world was a brutal place, where sentimentality was a weakness and love a liability. But she couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a terrible mistake, that they were sacrificing Isabella's happiness for the sake of their own ambitions. One evening, she received an invitation to a private gathering at the De Luca mansion. It was a bold move, a calculated risk on Lorenzo's part. He wanted her to see his world, to understand the pressures he was under, to meet the people who shaped his life. She knew she shouldn't go. It was too dangerous, too reckless. But she couldn't resist the pull, the desire to be with him, even for a few hours. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple black dress that accentuated her figure without being ostentatious. She wanted to blend in, to observe, to understand. As she entered the DeLuca mansion, she was struck by the opulence, the sheer display of wealth and power. The rooms were filled with priceless artwork, antique furniture, and the hushed murmur of conversations in Italian. She felt like an outsider, an intruder in a foreign land. Lorenzo greeted her at the door, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. He took her hand, his touch sending a familiar jolt of electricity through her. "You came," he said, his voice low and intimate. "I did," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. He led her through the crowded rooms, introducing her to his family and friends. She met his mother, a formidable woman with sharp eyes and a regal bearing, who regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She met his cousins, his uncles, the men who controlled the DeLuca empire. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing her, judging her. She was the enemy, the daughter of their rival, and yet, she was also Lorenzo's what?
Law.
Friend? She didn't know what to call it, this dangerous, forbidden thing that existed between them. As the evening progressed, the air of unease began to escalate. Whispers followed Francesca, and she sensed, rather than saw, Lorenzo's father glaring at them from across the room. She knew, in that moment, they were playing a game that was far more dangerous than she originally thought. The night ended with a tense, unspoken standoff. Francesca and Lorenzo stood together, isolated. It was only a matter of time. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Moonlight. The tension in the DeLuca mansion was a palpable thing, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. Francesca stood beside Lorenzo, feeling the weight of his father's gaze on her, a silent condemnation that echoed the whispers circulating through the room. She was an intruder, a foreign element in their carefully constructed world, and her presence was a disruption, a challenge to the established order. Lorenzo's hand tightened around hers, a silent reassurance that he was with her, that he wouldn't let them intimidate her. But she could feel the tension in his body, the unspoken strain of defying his father, of risking everything for her. Giovanni DeLuca finally approached them, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, his presence filling the room with a palpable sense of menace. He was a tall man, imposing, with a face etched with the hard lines of a life lived on the edge of violence. His eyes, dark and piercing, were fixed on Francesca, his expression a mixture of anger and disdain. "Lorenzo," he said, his voice a low growl. A word. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Lorenzo hesitated, his gaze meeting Francesca's, a silent apology in his eyes. "Go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll be fine." He squeezed her hand one last time, then released it, stepping away to join his father. Francesca watched them walk away, feeling a sense of dread creep over her. She was alone, surrounded by enemies, with no one to protect her but herself. She turned, scanning the room, searching for a friendly face, a sign of support. But there was none. The other guests avoided her gaze, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and hostility. She was an outsider, a threat, and they wanted nothing to do with her. She felt a hand on her arm, a gentle touch that made her jump. She turned, expecting to see one of Lorenzo's cousins, or worse, one of his father's henchmen. But it was a woman, an older woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Francesca, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft and melodic. "I'm Sophia, Lorenzo's aunt." Francesca relaxed slightly, relieved to find someone who didn't seem to hate her on sight. "It's nice to meet you, Sophia." Sophia smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Lorenzo speaks of you often," she said, her voice low and confidential. "He cares for you deeply." Francesca's heart skipped a beat. It was the first confirmation she'd had that Lorenzo's feelings for her were genuine, that they weren't just a figment of her imagination. He's a good man, Francesca said, her voice trembling slightly. Sophia nodded, her gaze understanding. He is. But he's also a DeLuca. He carries the weight of his family's history, the burden of his father's expectations. I know, Francesca said, her voice heavy with sadness. And I'm a Barone. Where we're not supposed to be together. Sophia sighed, her expression sympathetic. The world is full of supposed twos, Francesca. But sometimes, we have to follow our hearts, even when it's dangerous. Her words resonated with Francesca, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Sophia was an ally, a kindred spirit, someone who understood the complexities of love and loyalty in their world. They talked for a while longer, Sophia sharing stories of Lorenzo's childhood, of his rebellious spirit, his determination to forge his own path. She spoke of his mother, a woman who had loved deeply and suffered greatly, a woman who had taught Lorenzo the importance of compassion and empathy. As they talked, Francesca began to understand Lorenzo better, to see the man beneath the carefully constructed mask of the mafia prince. He was a complex, contradictory figure, torn between his duty to his family and his desire for something more. Finally, Lorenzo returned, his expression grim. He took Francesca's hand, his touch sending a familiar jolt of electricity through her. We need to go, he said, his voice tight. Francesca nodded, understanding. The situation was too volatile, too dangerous. They had pushed the boundaries far enough for one night. They left the mansion quickly, the whispers following them like shadows. As they walked to Lorenzo's car, Francesca could feel the tension radiating from him, the unspoken anger and frustration that he was struggling to contain. What did he say? She asked, her voice hesitant. Lorenzo sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. He forbade me from seeing you again. The words hung in the air, a heavy blow that knocked the wind out of Francesca. She had known it was coming, but hearing it aloud was still devastating. And? She prompted, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. And I told him I wouldn't obey. Francesca's heart leaped with a mixture of joy and terror. He was choosing her, defying his father, risking everything. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently caressing her cheeks. I won't let him control me, Francesca. I won't let him dictate my life. I love you. The words, spoken aloud for the first time, were a balm to her soul. She leaned into his touch, her eyes filling with tears. I love you too, Lorenzo, she whispered. He kissed her then, a desperate, passionate kiss that spoke of longing, of defiance, of a love that refused to be denied. The moonlight bathed them in its silvery glow, illuminating their embrace, a silent witness to their forbidden love. The whispers of the night seemed to fade away, replaced by the beating of their hearts, a rhythm of love and rebellion that echoed in the darkness. But even as they clung to each other, Francesca knew that the storm was far from over. They had declared their love, but the war was just beginning. Chapter 6. The Price of Loyalty. The aftermath of Lorenzo's declaration was swift and brutal. His father, Giovanni, wasted no time in retaliating. He cut Lorenzo off financially, stripping him of his inheritance, his position within the family, and his access to the DeLuca empire. It was a calculated move, designed to isolate Lorenzo, to force him to his knees, to make him beg for forgiveness. But Lorenzo didn't break. He'd anticipated his father's reaction, and he'd prepared for it. He had secret resources, hidden assets that his father didn't know about, accumulated over years of careful planning and shrewd investments. He wasn't as wealthy as he once was, but he wasn't destitute. He could survive. More importantly, he had Francesca. Her unwavering support, her belief in him, gave him the strength to endure his father's wrath. They found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from the opulent mansions of their families. It was a modest place, a stark contrast to the lives they'd always known, but it was theirs. It was a sanctuary, a refuge from the storm that raged around them. Francesca, too, faced consequences for her defiance. Her father, Don Antonio, was furious. He accused her of betrayal, of consorting with the enemy, of dishonoring the Barone name. He threatened to disown her, to cut her off from the family, just as Giovanni had done to Lorenzo. But Francesca stood firm. She'd made her choice, and she wouldn't back down. She loved Lorenzo, and she wouldn't abandon him, no matter the cost. "You're throwing your life away, Francesca," her father roared, his face contorted with rage. "For what? For DeLuca? For a man who will never be worthy of you?" "He's worth more than all of this," Francesca replied, her voice calm but firm, gesturing to the opulent surroundings of the Barone mansion. "He's worth more than the money, the power, the prestige. He loves me, Papa. And I love him." Antonio scoffed, his eyes filled with disdain. "Love? Love is a weakness, Francesca. A foolish emotion that blinds you to reality. The only thing that matters is loyalty. Loyalty to your family, to your blood. And what about my loyalty to myself?" Francesca challenged, her voice rising. "What about my own happiness? Don't I deserve to choose my own path, to live my own life?" Antonio stared at her, his expression unyielding. "You are a Barone, Francesca. Your life is not your own. It belongs to the family." The conversation ended in a stalemate, a tense silence that hung heavy in the air. Francesca knew she couldn't change her father's mind. He was too entrenched in his beliefs, too blinded by his hatred of the DeLucas. She left the mansion, her heart heavy with sadness and frustration. She was torn between her love for Lorenzo and her loyalty to her family. It was a choice no one should have to make, a burden no one should have to bear. She returned to the apartment, to the quiet sanctuary she shared with Lorenzo. He was waiting for her, his eyes filled with concern. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice gentle. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. He won't listen. He says I'm betraying the family." Lorenzo pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his embrace a comforting haven in the midst of her turmoil. "I'm sorry, Francesca," he whispered. "I never wanted to put you in this position. I never wanted to make you choose." "I chose you, Lorenzo," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I chose you, and I don't regret it." He kissed the top of her head, his lips lingering on her hair. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice firm. "Together. We'll build our own life, our own family, free from the shadows of the past." His words gave her strength, a renewed sense of hope. They would face the challenges together, united by their love, their determination to forge a new path. Life had changed drastically, but there were moments cooked in their little kitchen, the simple joy of being together, that made Francesca certain. But the price of their loyalty to each other was steep. They were ostracized by their families, shunned by their former friends, forced to live in the shadows, constantly looking over their shoulders. The mafia world was a small one, and their defiance had not gone unnoticed. There were whispers, threats, veiled warnings that they couldn't ignore. One evening, as they were walking home from a quiet dinner at a local trattoria, they were confronted by a group of men, shadowy figures who emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden by scarves. "Lorenzo DeLuca," one of the men said, his voice a menacing growl. "Your father sends his regards." Francesca's blood ran cold. She knew what was coming. It was a message, a warning, a reminder of the power that Giovanni DeLuca still wielded. The price they chose to pay was coming due. Chapter 7. Scars of the Past. Lorenzo pushed Francesca behind him, shielding her with his body. He knew this confrontation was inevitable, a consequence of his defiance. He'd hoped to avoid it, to protect Francesca from the violence that was so ingrained in his world, but he knew that was a foolish hope. "What do you want?" Lorenzo asked, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the fear that churned in his gut. The leader of the men chuckled, a cruel, humorless sound. "We're just here to deliver a message, DeLuca. A reminder that your father's reach is long, and his memory is longer." Lorenzo stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. "Tell my father I'm not afraid of him." The man laughed again, stepping closer, invading Lorenzo's personal space. "Brave words, DeLuca. But bravery won't save you. Or your whore. The insult ignited a fire in Lorenzo's blood. He lunged forward, his fist connecting with the man's jaw, sending him sprawling to the ground. The other men reacted instantly, attacking Lorenzo with a brutal efficiency. Francesca screamed, her voice echoing in the night. She tried to intervene, to pull them off Lorenzo, but she was shoved aside, her head hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. The world exploded in a kaleidoscope of pain and darkness. She saw flashes of violence, heard the sounds of struggle, Lorenzo's grunts of pain, the men's cruel laughter. And then everything went black. When Francesca regained consciousness, she was lying on the ground, her head throbbing, her body aching. She blinked, trying to focus her vision, the world swimming around her in a dizzying blur. She saw Lorenzo, kneeling beside her, his face bruised and bloodied, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and terror. "Francesca," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Are you all right? Can you hear me?" She nodded, wincing in pain. What happened? They attacked us," he said, his voice shaking. "My father's men. They wanted to send a message." Francesca struggled to sit up, her head spinning. She saw the aftermath of the fight, the scattered debris, the bloodstains on the pavement. It was a brutal reminder of the world they lived in, the violence that lurked beneath the surface of their carefully constructed lives. Lorenzo helped her to her feet, his arms supporting her weight. She leaned on him, her body trembling, her mind reeling. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to get you to a doctor." They stumbled back to their apartment, their bodies battered and bruised, their spirits shaken. Lorenzo cleaned her wounds, his touch gentle and caring, his eyes filled with a remorse that tore at her heart. "I'm so sorry, Francesca," he whispered. "I should have protected you. I should have known this would happen." She reached out, her hand cupping his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "It's not your fault, Lorenzo. It's the life we live. The choices we've made." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, his body trembling with a mixture of pain and relief. "I won't let them hurt you again, Francesca. I swear it." As the days turned into weeks, Francesca slowly recovered from her physical injuries. But the emotional scars ran deeper. The attack had shattered her sense of security, her belief that they could escape the violence of their world. She was constantly on edge, jumping at every noise, her heart pounding with fear whenever Lorenzo left the apartment. She started having nightmares, vivid dreams of violence and betrayal, of being chased by shadowy figures, of losing Lorenzo forever. She would wake up screaming, her body drenched in sweat, her heart racing. Lorenzo was always there for her, holding her close, comforting her, whispering words of reassurance. He was her rock, her anchor in the storm, the one constant in her chaotic life. But she could see the toll it was taking on him. He was exhausted, stressed, constantly looking over his shoulder, his sleep troubled and restless. The weight of his father's wrath, the burden of protecting her, was crushing him. One night, as they lay in bed, Francesca turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. "I can't do this anymore, Lorenzo," she whispered. "I can't live like this. Always afraid. Always looking over my shoulder." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. "I know, Francesca. I know it's hard. But we'll get through this. We'll find a way." "How?" she asked, her voice desperate. "How can we escape this? How can we ever be free?" He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. They were trapped, caught in a cycle of violence and revenge that seemed inescapable. The scars of the past, the wounds inflicted by their families, were too deep, too raw. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that their love, their defiance, would come at a terrible price. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the sound of their breathing and the distant sirens wailing in the night, a constant reminder of the darkness that surrounded them. Chapter 8. Between Duty and Desire. The attack had been a brutal awakening, a stark reminder of the forces arrayed against them. Yet it also served to strengthen Francesca and Lorenzo's resolve. They were in this together, for better or for worse, and they would face whatever came their way, united by their love and their determination to forge a new path. But forging that path proved to be more difficult than they imagined. They were constantly caught between the conflicting demands of duty and desire, torn between their loyalty to their families and their love for each other. Lorenzo, despite being ostracized by his father, still felt a sense of responsibility towards his family, particularly his mother and younger sister. He worried about them, about their safety, about the impact his defiance was having on their lives. He started making discreet inquiries, using his remaining contacts within the DeLuca organization to gather information, to ensure that his mother and sister were protected. He discovered that his father was facing increasing pressure from rival families, who saw his weakened position as an opportunity to challenge the DeLuca empire. This news filled Lorenzo with a mixture of anxiety and anger. He hated his father, but he also felt a sense of protectiveness towards his family, towards the legacy that had been built over generations. He couldn't stand idly by and watch everything they had worked for crumble. He started contemplating a dangerous course of action, reaching out to his father, offering his help, negotiating a truce. He knew it was a long shot, that his father might reject him outright, but he felt compelled to try. Francesca, meanwhile, was struggling with her own internal conflicts. She missed her family, her brother Marco, her cousins, the familiar comfort of the Barone mansion. She yearned for a reconciliation, for a way to bridge the chasm that had opened up between them. She received a secret message from Isabella, her cousin, who was increasingly unhappy with the impending Rossi marriage. Isabella confided in Francesca, sharing her fears and doubts, her longing for a love that was true and genuine, not a strategic alliance. Francesca felt a surge of protectiveness towards Isabella, a determination to help her escape the fate that had been planned for her. She knew she couldn't interfere directly, that it would only make things worse, but she started exploring other options, searching for a way to undermine the Rossi alliance without putting Isabella in danger. She discovered that Alessandro Rossi, Isabella's betrothed, had a secret weakness, a gambling addiction that had put him deeply in debt to several unsavory characters. This information was a potential weapon, a way to discredit him, to make him an unsuitable match for Isabella. But using this information was risky. It could expose Isabella to ridicule, to shame, and it could provoke the Rossi family, leading to further violence and bloodshed. Francesca was torn, unsure of what to do. One evening, as she and Lorenzo sat on their small balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, they shared their concerns, their fears, their conflicting loyalties. "I don't know what to do, Lorenzo," Francesca said, her voice filled with frustration. "I want to help Isabella, but I don't want to make things worse. I want to reconcile with my family, but I don't want to betray you." Lorenzo took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, a silent promise of support. "And I want to protect my family, but I don't want to go back to that life. I don't want to become my father." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their dilemmas pressing down on them. They were caught in a web of conflicting obligations, a maze of impossible choices. Maybe there's no way out," Francesca said, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe we're destined to be enemies, to be torn apart by our family's hatred." Lorenzo shook his head, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "No, Francesca. I refuse to believe that. We have to find a way. We have to create our own destiny." He pulled her close, his embrace a comforting haven in the midst of their turmoil. "We'll do it together," he said, his voice firm. "We'll face whatever comes our way, united by our love, our strength, our refusal to give up." His words gave her hope, a renewed sense of purpose. They were in this together, and they would fight for their future, for their love, for a life free from the shadows of the past. But even as they clung to each other, they knew that the path ahead would be fraught with danger, with sacrifice, with choices that would test their loyalty and their love to the breaking point. The city lights seemed to mock their fragile hope, a vast, indifferent backdrop to their struggle, a constant reminder of the powerful forces arrayed against them. And yet, in each other's arms, They found the strength to face the darkness, to believe in the possibility of a dawn that might never come. Chapter 9. A Gathering Storm. The fragile peace that Francesca and Lorenzo had carved out for themselves was shattered by a series of events that escalated the conflict between their families to a boiling point. First, Alessandro Rossi, fueled by his gambling debts and his growing resentment towards the De Lucas, made a bold move. He orchestrated a series of attacks on De Luca businesses, disrupting their operations, stealing their shipments, and sending a clear message of defiance. Giovanni De Luca, enraged by Rossi's audacity, retaliated with swift and brutal force. He ordered his men to strike back, targeting Rossi's assets, his allies, and even his family members. The city became a battleground, the streets echoing with the sounds of gunfire and violence. Francesca and Lorenzo were caught in the crossfire, their lives in constant danger. They knew that they were targets, that both families saw them as traitors, as liabilities to be eliminated. Then, a second blow struck. Isabella, desperate to escape the Rossi marriage, made a reckless decision. She ran away, disappearing without a trace, leaving behind a note that accused Alessandro of being a cruel and abusive man. The Barone family was thrown into chaos. Antonio was furious, humiliated by Isabella's defection, and convinced that the De Lucas were behind it. He ordered his men to find her, to bring her back, and to punish anyone who had helped her escape. Francesca knew that she had to find Isabella before her father did. She feared for her cousin's safety, knowing that Antonio would stop at nothing to restore the family's honor. She reached out to Lorenzo, pleading for his help. He hesitated, knowing that getting involved would further enrage both families, but he couldn't refuse her. He loved her, and he would do anything to protect her and her cousin. They began a frantic search, following a trail of cryptic clues that Isabella had left behind. They discovered that she had sought refuge with a group of nuns, living in a secluded convent outside the city. But they weren't the only ones looking for her. Antonio's men were closing in, their intentions far from benign. And Alessandro Rossi, desperate to salvage his reputation and his alliance with the Baroness, was also on the hunt, fueled by a mixture of anger and revenge. The situation was a powder keg, ready to explode. Francesca and Lorenzo were racing against time, trying to reach Isabella before their families did, knowing that the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. One evening, as they were driving to the convent, they were ambushed by a group of armed men. A hail of bullets shattered their car windows, forcing them off the road. They crashed into a ditch, the impact jarring them, leaving them dazed and disoriented. Lorenzo, his instincts honed by years of living in a world of violence, reacted quickly. He pulled Francesca from the wreckage, shielding her with his body as he returned fire. A fierce gun battle ensued, the air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Francesca huddled behind the overturned car, her heart pounding with terror, praying for Lorenzo's safety. He fought with a desperate ferocity, his movements precise and deadly. He took down several of the attackers, but they were outnumbered, their ammunition running low. Just when it seemed that all hope was lost, a new group of men arrived on the scene. They were De Luca men, loyal to Lorenzo, who had been secretly following them, providing protection. They joined the fight, turning the tide of the battle. The attackers, overwhelmed and outgunned, retreated, disappearing into the night. Lorenzo, bruised and bleeding, rushed to Francesca's side. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, his body trembling with relief. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her tears mixing with the blood on his face. I thought I'd lost you." He kissed her then, a desperate, passionate kiss that spoke of survival, of love, of a bond that had been forged in the fires of adversity. They had survived the ambush, but the storm was far from over. The conflict between their families was escalating, the violence spiraling out of control, and they knew that they were running out of time, that they had to find a way to end the war before it consumed them all. The night was filled with the sounds of sirens and the distant echoes of gunfire, a constant reminder of the gathering storm that threatened to engulf them, to destroy everything they held dear. Chapter 10. The Unraveling of Trust. The attack had been a turning point, a stark reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Francesca and Lorenzo knew they couldn't continue living on the run, constantly looking over their shoulders. They needed a plan, a way to end the conflict, to secure their future, and to protect those they loved. They decided to focus on Isabella. Finding her, protecting her, and exposing Alessandro Rossi's true nature was their priority. They knew that if they could discredit him, they could break the Rossi alliance, weakening their enemies and potentially paving the way for a truce. With the help of Lorenzo's loyal men, they tracked Isabella to the convent, a secluded sanctuary hidden amidst rolling hills and ancient forests. They arrived under the cover of darkness, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. They found Isabella safe, but shaken. She was terrified of her father, of Alessandro, of the life that had been planned for her. She clung to Francesca, her tears flowing freely, her body trembling with fear. "I can't go back, Francesca," she whispered. "I can't marry him. He's a monster." Francesca held her cousin close, comforting her, assuring her that she wouldn't let anything happen to her. Lorenzo, meanwhile, was working on a plan to expose Alessandro. He used his contacts within the underworld to gather evidence of Rossi's gambling debts, his illicit dealings, and his abusive behavior. He compiled a dossier of incriminating information, a weapon that could destroy Rossi's reputation and ruin his alliance with the Baroness. But using this information was risky. It could provoke Rossi, leading to further violence, and it could expose Isabella to public scrutiny and shame. They needed to find a way to present the evidence discreetly, to the right people, at the right time. They decided to reach out to Marco, Francesca's brother. He was a man of reason, of logic, and he had always been protective of Isabella. They hoped that he would listen to them, that he would see the truth, and that he would help them end the conflict. They arranged a secret meeting, a clandestine rendezvous in a neutral location. It was a dangerous gamble, a risk that could expose them to both families, but they had no other choice. They met Marco in a dimly lit warehouse, the air thick with tension and mistrust. Marco was accompanied by several of his father's men, their hands hovering near their weapons, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Lorenzo presented the evidence, laying out the case against Alessandro Rossi in a calm, methodical manner. He showed Marco the documents, the photographs, the witness statements, the irrefutable proof of Rossi's duplicity and cruelty. Marco listened intently, his expression unreadable. He examined the evidence carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration, his jaw tight, with unspoken emotion. Francesca watched her brother, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She knew that his decision would determine their fate, their future, their very lives. Finally, Marco looked up, his eyes meeting Francesca's. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low and grave. Francesca nodded, her tears welling up in her eyes. "It's true, Marco. Alessandro is not the man you think he is. He's dangerous. He's a threat to Isabella, to all of us." Marco turned to Lorenzo, his gaze piercing. "And you? What's your role in all this? What do you gain from exposing Rossi?" Lorenzo met his gaze unflinchingly. "I gain nothing," he said, his voice firm, "except the safety of the woman I love, and the hope of ending this senseless war." The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension, with years of mistrust and animosity. Marco was torn, caught between his loyalty to his family and the evidence presented before him. He was a man of honor, a man who valued truth and justice, but he was also a Baron, bound by the code of silence, the tradition of obedience. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. "I believe you," he said, "but I can't guarantee my father will." The unraveling of trust had begun, but the path ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty, in danger, in the potential for betrayal. The warehouse seemed to hold its breath, the shadows deepening, the silence amplifying the weight of their decision, the fragility of their hope. Chapter 11. Masks and Mirrors. Marco's cautious acceptance was a small victory, but it was far from a guarantee of peace. He warned Francesca and Lorenzo that convincing their father, Don Antonio, would be a monumental task. The Don was a man of unwavering pride and deeply ingrained prejudice, unlikely to listen to reason, especially when it came from a De Luca. Nevertheless, Marco agreed to present the evidence to his father, to try and persuade him to reconsider the Rossi alliance. He promised to do everything in his power to protect Isabella, to ensure her safety, and to prevent further bloodshed. Francesca and Lorenzo left the meeting with a fragile sense of hope, but also with a lingering unease. They knew that they were walking a tightrope, that one wrong move could send them tumbling into the abyss. They returned to their secluded apartment, their sanctuary, their refuge from the storm that raged around them. They held each other close, finding solace in their shared love, their unwavering commitment to each other.
"What do we do now?"
Francesca asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lorenzo sighed, running a hand through his dark hair.
"We wait," he said.
"We wait and we prepare. We hope for the best, but we expect the worst." They spent the next few days in a state of anxious anticipation, their nerves frayed, their sleep troubled. They jumped at every noise, every shadow, every unexpected phone call. Then the news came. Marco had confronted his father, presenting the evidence against Alessandro Rossi. The Don, enraged by the betrayal, had initially refused to believe it. He accused Marco of being manipulated by the De Lucas, of siding with the enemy. But Marco had persisted, presenting further proof, appealing to his father's sense of justice, his love for Isabella. He argued that the Rossi alliance was a mistake, that it would only lead to further violence and bloodshed. Finally, after a long and heated argument, Antonio had relented. He agreed to call off the marriage, to sever ties with the Rossi family. But he did so with a caveat, a condition that sent a chill down Francesca's spine. He demanded a meeting with Lorenzo. A face-to-face confrontation, a chance to settle the score, to determine the future of their families once and for all. Francesca was terrified. She knew that it was a trap, a ploy to lure Lorenzo into a vulnerable position, to eliminate him and end the threat he posed. "You can't go, Lorenzo," she pleaded. "It's too dangerous.
He'll kill you."
Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and resignation. "I have to, Francesca. It's the only way. It's the only chance we have to end this." He knew that it was a gamble, a risk that could cost him his life, but he was willing to take it. He was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of living in fear. He wanted to face his father, to confront him, to try and find a way to break the cycle of violence and hatred. The meeting was arranged at a neutral location, an abandoned church on the outskirts of the city. It was a place of symbolism, a place of peace and reconciliation, but also a place of shadows and secrets. Francesca insisted on accompanying Lorenzo, despite his protests. She wouldn't let him face his father alone. She would stand by his side, no matter the consequences. They arrived at the church, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the creaking of the old wooden doors and the distant sounds of the city. Antonio Barone was waiting for them, surrounded by his men, his face a mask of cold fury. Giovanni De Luca, surprisingly, was not present, which was a confusing curveball in what was an already confusing situation. Marco stood beside his father, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and regret. The two families faced each other, the masks they wore in public firmly in place, the mirrors reflecting their shared history of violence and betrayal. The church seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion, the final confrontation that would determine their fate. And Francesca, standing beside Lorenzo, knew that this was the moment of truth, the moment that would either break them or make them whole. Everything they had fought for, everything they had risked, came down to this. Chapter 12. A glimmer of hope. The tension in the abandoned church was palpable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on Francesca and Lorenzo. They stood facing Don Antonio and his men, the years of animosity and bloodshed hanging heavy in the air. Marco stood beside his father, his face a mask of conflicting emotions, his loyalty torn between his family and the fragile hope for peace. So, Antonio Barone began, his voice a low growl that echoed through the cavernous space. The prodigal son returns, and he brings the enemy with him. Lorenzo met his gaze unflinchingly. I'm not your enemy, Don Antonio, and Francesca is not your prisoner. We're here to talk, to try and find a way to end this senseless war. Antonio scoffed, his eyes filled with disdain. There is nothing to talk about, DeLuca. You have betrayed your family, disgraced your name, and sided with our sworn enemies. There is no forgiveness for such treachery. I did what I had to do, Lorenzo replied, his voice firm. I chose love over hate, peace over violence.
Il chose Francesca.
Antonio's gaze shifted to Francesca, his expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. And you, Francesca? You have betrayed your family, your blood. For this DeLuca? Francesca stepped forward, her head held high, her voice clear and strong. I love Lorenzo, Papa, and I believe in him. I believe that we can build a different future, a future free from the hatred and violence that has defined our lives. Antonio stared at her, his expression unyielding. You are naive, Francesca. You are blinded by your emotions. The DeLucas are our enemies. They always have been, and they always will be. That's not true, Papa, Marco interjected, his voice rising. We've been blinded by our own hatred, by our own thirst for revenge. We've made mistakes, both families. It's time to end this. It's time to choose a different path. Antonio turned to his son, his eyes narrowed in anger. You dare to defy me, Marco? You dare to side with the enemy? I'm not siding with the enemy, Papa, Marco replied, his voice pleading. I'm siding with reason. I'm siding with peace. I'm siding with my sister's happiness. The argument escalated, the voices rising, the tension in the church reaching a fever pitch. Francesca and Lorenzo watched, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. They knew that Marco was their only ally, their only chance to break through Antonio's stubborn resistance. Suddenly, a new voice interrupted the heated exchange. Enough. It was Sophia, Lorenzo's aunt, who had entered the church unnoticed. She stood near the entrance, her presence commanding, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. This has gone on long enough, she said, her voice echoing through the silent church. We have shed enough blood. We have caused enough pain. It's time to stop. Antonio turned to her, his expression surprised. Sophia? What are you doing here? Sophia stepped forward, her gaze meeting Antonio's. I'm here to remind you of who we are, Antonio.
Of who we used to be.
We were friends once. We were allies. We shared a common bond, a common heritage. She spoke of the past, of the friendship between Antonio and Giovanni DeLuca, of the woman who had come between them, of the mistakes that had been made, of the betrayals that had fueled the decades-long feud. She spoke of the cost of hatred, of the lives that had been lost, of the families that had been torn apart. She spoke of the need for forgiveness, for reconciliation, for a new beginning. Her words hung in the air, a powerful plea for peace, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Antonio listened, his expression softening slightly, his eyes losing some of their cold fury. He looked at Francesca, at Lorenzo, at Marco, at Sophia. He saw the pain in their eyes, the longing for a different future, the yearning for an end to the violence. He sighed, his shoulders slumping, his body seeming to deflate with the weight of his years, his regrets, his unspoken remorse. Perhaps you're right, Sophia, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Perhaps it's time to try a different way. The words were tentative, hesitant, but they were enough. A glimmer of hope had appeared, a crack in the wall of hatred and animosity. The church seemed to exhale, the tension easing slightly, the shadows receding, replaced by a fragile sense of possibility. Francesca and Lorenzo exchanged a look, their hearts filled with a cautious optimism, their hands clasping tightly, their love a beacon in the darkness. The path ahead was still uncertain, But for the first time in a long time, they dared to believe that peace might be possible. Chapter 13. The Heart's Betrayal. Antonio's tentative agreement to consider peace was a monumental step, but it was only the beginning of a long and arduous process. The decades of animosity and bloodshed between the Baroness and the De Lucas couldn't be erased overnight. There were still deep-seated mistrust, lingering resentments, and powerful forces working against reconciliation. The biggest obstacle was Giovanni De Luca. Unlike Antonio, who had shown a glimmer of willingness to change, Giovanni remained steadfast in his hatred, his thirst for revenge. He saw Lorenzo's actions as a betrayal, a weakness, and he was determined to punish him, to make him pay for his defiance. Sophia, despite her influence and her pleas for peace, couldn't sway Giovanni. He refused to listen to reason, to consider any possibility of reconciliation. He was consumed by his bitterness, his anger, his desire to destroy the Baroness, no matter the cost. This presented a significant challenge for Francesca and Lorenzo. They knew that they couldn't achieve lasting peace without Giovanni's cooperation, but he was an immovable object, a force of nature that seemed impossible to overcome. They decided to focus on building bridges with the Baroness, on strengthening their relationship with Marco, on demonstrating their commitment to a different future. They worked with Marco to address the concerns of the Barone family, to reassure them that Lorenzo was not a threat, that he had no desire to harm them. They also reached out to other mafia families, seeking their support, their mediation, their influence in persuading Giovanni to reconsider his position. It was a delicate dance, a complex negotiation that required patience, diplomacy, and a willingness to compromise. Meanwhile, Isabella remained hidden at the convent, protected by Francesca and Lorenzo, and supported by Marco. She was slowly recovering from the trauma of her past, beginning to heal, to rebuild her life. She expressed a desire to meet Lorenzo, to thank him for his help, for his courage in defying his own father. Francesca arranged the meeting, a cautious encounter at a neutral location, a small cafe in a quiet neighborhood. Isabella and Lorenzo met, their initial awkwardness gradually giving way to a genuine connection. They shared their stories, their fears, their hopes for the future. Isabella saw in Lorenzo a kindred spirit, a man who had also suffered from the constraints of family expectations, the burden of a legacy he didn't want. Their meeting was interrupted by a shocking discovery. A hidden microphone, planted in the cafe, revealed that their conversation had been recorded. Someone was spying on them, listening to their every word, plotting against them. The question was who? Was it Giovanni De Luca, seeking to gather evidence against his son? Was it Alessandro Rossi, seeking revenge for his humiliation? Or was it someone else entirely, someone with their own hidden agenda? The discovery sent a chill down Francesca's spine. It was a betrayal, a violation of their privacy, a reminder that they were still living in a world of shadows and secrets, where trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. They realized that they were surrounded by enemies, that they couldn't trust anyone, not even those who seemed to be on their side. The masks had come off, revealing the true faces of those around them, and the mirrors reflected a distorted reality, a world of deception and manipulation. The heart's betrayal was the most painful of all. Francesca began to suspect that someone close to them, someone they trusted, was working against them, feeding information to their enemies, sabotaging their efforts to achieve peace. She confided in Lorenzo, sharing her fears, her suspicions. He listened intently, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and concern. "We need to be careful, Francesca," he said. "We need to watch our backs. We can't trust anyone." They began to investigate, to unravel the web of deceit that surrounded them, to identify the traitor in their midst. The search would lead them down a dark and dangerous path, a path that would test their loyalty, their love, and their courage to the breaking point. The cafe seemed to hold its breath, the silence amplifying the weight of their discovery, the fragility of their trust, the chilling realization that the enemy was closer than they thought. Chapter 14. Into the Lion's Denver. The discovery of the hidden microphone shattered the fragile trust Francesca and Lorenzo had painstakingly built. They were surrounded by enemies, some known, others hidden, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down for a moment. Their investigation into the betrayal led them down a winding path of clues and red herrings. They suspected everyone, from Marco's closest associates to Lorenzo's estranged family members. The paranoia was suffocating, poisoning their relationships and making it difficult to know who to trust. After weeks of dead ends, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Lorenzo's former contacts within the De Luca organization, a man who had remained loyal to him despite the risks, provided a crucial piece of information. He revealed that Giovanni De Luca had been secretly communicating with Alessandro Rossi, plotting to undermine the fragile peace and reignite the war between the families. The news was a devastating blow. It confirmed Francesca's worst fears, that Giovanni was not only unwilling to reconcile, but was actively working to destroy them. It also implicated Alessandro, who was clearly seeking revenge for his humiliation and the loss of the Barone alliance. Lorenzo, enraged by his father's treachery and Alessandro's continued interference, decided to take a bold and dangerous step. He decided to confront his father directly, to expose his betrayal and to force him to choose between his hatred and the future of his family. Francesca was terrified. She knew that it was a suicide mission, that Giovanni was a ruthless and unpredictable man who wouldn't hesitate to kill his own son. "You can't go, Lorenzo," she pleaded. "It's too dangerous."
He'll kill you.
Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and resignation. "I have to, Francesca. It's the only way. I can't let him destroy everything we've worked for. I can't let him win." He knew that it was a gamble, a risk that could cost him his life, but he was willing to take it. He was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of living in fear. He wanted to face his father, to confront him, to try and break the cycle of violence and hatred. Francesca, despite her fear, knew that she couldn't stop him. She understood his need to confront his father, to reclaim his life, to fight for their future. She decided to accompany him, to stand by his side, no matter the consequences. She wouldn't let him face his father alone. She would be his strength, his support, his shield. They planned their confrontation carefully, choosing a time and place where they would have the element of surprise. They decided to infiltrate the De Luca mansion under the cover of darkness, while Giovanni was hosting a gathering of his closest allies. It was a daring plan, fraught with danger, but it was their only option. They were walking into the lion's den, facing their greatest enemy, with no guarantee of survival. They arrived at the mansion, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. They moved silently through the shadows, avoiding the guards, their movements precise and practiced. They reached Giovanni's study, the heart of the De Luca Empire, where he was meeting with his inner circle. They could hear the murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, the sounds of a celebration that masked a sinister plot. Lorenzo took a deep breath, his hand resting on the doorknob. He looked at Francesca, his eyes filled with love and determination. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Francesca nodded, her hand gripping his, her heart filled with a fierce love and a terrifying premonition. They were stepping into the unknown, facing their greatest challenge, with their lives hanging in the balance. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, the darkness amplifying the danger, the silence echoing the unspoken question. Would they survive the night? Chapter 15. Shattered Reflections. Lorenzo pushed open the door to his father's study, stepping into a scene that was both familiar and foreign. The room was richly decorated, filled with antique furniture, priceless artwork, and the lingering scent of cigar smoke and expensive whiskey. Giovanni De Luca sat at his large mahogany desk, surrounded by his closest advisors, their faces a mixture of surprise and apprehension at the unexpected intrusion. Giovanni's eyes narrowed as he saw Lorenzo, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. Lorenzo stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "I know about your plan, father. I know about your alliance with Alessandro Rossi. I know you're plotting to reignite the war. The room fell silent, the tension thickening, the advisors exchanging uneasy glances. Giovanni's face turned a shade darker, his hand instinctively reaching for the drawer where he kept his gun. You dare to accuse me, you traitor? He spat, his voice dripping with venom. I'm not accusing you, father, Lorenzo replied, his voice calm but firm. I'm telling you. I have proof. I know everything. He produced the evidence he had gathered, the recordings of Giovanni's conversations with Alessandro, the documents outlining their plans, the witness statements confirming their plot. He laid it all out on the desk, the incriminating evidence a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. The advisors stared at the documents, their faces paling, their eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and fear. Giovanni stared at the evidence, his expression unreadable. He knew he was cornered, his betrayal exposed, his plans ruined. He looked at Lorenzo, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and something else. Was it regret? Was it fear? Was it a flicker of recognition of the son he had pushed away? You would betray your own father? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. I'm not betraying you, father, Lorenzo replied. I'm trying to save you. I'm trying to save our family. I'm trying to end this senseless war. The silence stretched between them, a tense standoff between father and son, between the past and the future, between hatred and the fragile hope for reconciliation. Suddenly, a shot rang out, shattering the silence, shattering the fragile peace. Francesca screamed, her eyes widening in horror as she saw Lorenzo crumple to the ground, his hand clutching his chest, blood staining his shirt. Giovanni stared at the scene, his eyes wide with disbelief, his hand still holding the smoking gun. He hadn't fired it. The shot had come from behind him. One of his advisors, a man he had trusted for years, stood with a gun in his hand, his face a mask of cold determination. It was a coup, a power grab, a betrayal within a betrayal. The advisor, a man named Sal DeMarco, stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with ambition. The old ways are dead, Giovanni, he said. It's time for a new order. It's time for a new leader. Chaos erupted in the room. The other advisors scrambled for cover, unsure of who to trust, who to follow. The De Luca Empire was crumbling, shattered by internal conflict, by betrayal, by the insatiable thirst for power. Francesca rushed to Lorenzo's side, cradling his head in her lap, her tears mixing with his blood. She pressed her hand against his wound, trying to stem the bleeding, her heart breaking with every shallow breath he took. Lorenzo, she sobbed. Stay with me. Please stay with me. He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and a fading light. He reached out, his hand weakly touching her cheek. Francesca, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I love you. His hand fell limp, his eyes closed, his breathing stopped. Francesca screamed, her voice echoing through the room, a primal cry of grief and despair. She had lost him. She had lost everything. The reflections of the life they had dreamed of were shattered, the pieces scattered across the floor of the study, stained with blood and betrayal. The room spun, the faces blurred, the sounds faded into a distant roar. All that remained was the cold emptiness, the devastating realization that her love, her hope, her future, had been stolen from her. Chapter 16. The Cost of Redemption. Francesca's world had collapsed. Lorenzo, her love, her anchor, her future, was gone. The pain was unbearable, a crushing weight that threatened to suffocate her. She knelt beside his lifeless body, her tears falling onto his face, her heart shattered into a million pieces. The chaos in the room continued, the power struggle between Sal DeMarco and the remaining De Luca advisors escalating into a violent confrontation. Gunfire erupted, the sounds of struggle echoing through the mansion, the De Luca Empire tearing itself apart from within. Francesca was oblivious to the violence around her. All that mattered was Lorenzo, the man she had loved, the man who had sacrificed everything for her, for peace, for a future that would never be. Suddenly, She felt a hand on her shoulder, a gentle touch that pulled her back from the abyss of her grief. She looked up, her eyes blurred with tears, and saw Marco standing beside her. He had arrived at the mansion, alerted by one of his contacts within the DeLuca organization, and had witnessed the aftermath of the shooting, the chaos, the betrayal. He knelt beside her, his face filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Francesca," he said, his voice gentle but firm.
We need to go.
"It's not safe here." She shook her head, her body trembling, her mind unable to process his words. I can't leave him," she sobbed.
Marco understood.
He knew the depth of her love for Lorenzo, the pain she was enduring. But he also knew that staying would be suicide. "He's gone, Francesca," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "But we're not. We need to survive. We need to honor his memory. We need to finish what he started." His words struck a chord, a spark of defiance igniting within her grief-stricken heart. Lorenzo had sacrificed his life for peace, for a better future. She couldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. She allowed Marco to help her to her feet, her legs shaky, her body trembling. They left the study, leaving behind the chaos, the violence, the lifeless body of the man she loved. They escaped the mansion, the sounds of gunfire fading behind them, the night air cold against their faces. Marco took her to a safe house, a secluded location where she could grieve, where she could heal, where she could plan her next move. The following days were a blur of grief and anger, of despair and determination. Francesca mourned Lorenzo, her tears flowing endlessly, her heart aching with a pain she thought would never end. But amidst her grief, a new resolve began to grow. She wouldn't let Lorenzo's death be in vain. She would avenge him. She would finish what he started. She would bring peace to their families, even if it cost her everything. She reached out to Sofia, Lorenzo's aunt, who was devastated by her nephew's death and enraged by the betrayal within her family. Sofia, despite her grief, was a powerful ally, a woman of influence and determination. Together, they began to plot their revenge, their plan to dismantle Sal DeMarco's power grab, to expose his treachery, and to restore order to the DeLuca family. They also reached out to other mafia families, seeking their support, their intervention, their condemnation of Sal's actions. The cost of redemption was high. Lorenzo had paid the ultimate price, and Francesca was willing to do the same. She was no longer the naive, sheltered woman she had once been. She had been forged in the fires of love and loss, of betrayal and violence. She was a warrior, a survivor, a force to be reckoned with. And she wouldn't rest until she had avenged Lorenzo's death and brought peace to their world. The safe house became her sanctuary and her war room, the silence filled with the echoes of her grief and the steel of her resolve, the darkness illuminated by the flickering flame of her determination. Chapter 17. Beneath the surface. Francesca, fueled by grief and a burning desire for justice, began to orchestrate her plan. Sofia, with her deep connections within the mafia world, proved to be an invaluable ally. They worked in secret, gathering evidence against Sal DeMarco, exposing his ruthless ambition and his betrayal of the DeLuca family. They discovered that Sal had been plotting his takeover for years, carefully manipulating events, sowing discord, and positioning himself to seize power at the opportune moment. He had used Alessandro Rossi as a pawn, exploiting his weaknesses and fueling his resentment towards the DeLucas to further his own agenda. Francesca also learned a shocking truth about Lorenzo's death. The bullet that had killed him hadn't been meant for him. It had been meant for Giovanni. Sal had intended to eliminate both father and son, clearing the path for his own ascension to the head of the DeLuca family. This revelation fueled Francesca's rage and strengthened her resolve. She wouldn't rest until Sal DeMarco was brought to justice, until he paid for his crimes, until Lorenzo's death was avenged. She and Sofia began to leak information to the other mafia families, exposing Sal's treachery and undermining his support. They presented evidence of his involvement in Lorenzo's death, his manipulation of Alessandro Rossi, and his plans to destabilize the fragile peace that had been achieved. The other families, initially hesitant to intervene, began to turn against Sal. They saw him as a dangerous and unpredictable element, a threat to the stability of the underworld. They condemned his actions, withdrew their support, and began to pressure him to step down. Meanwhile, Marco, torn between his loyalty to his family and his commitment to peace, was working from within the Barone organization to solidify support for Francesca's plan. He had gained his father's cautious trust, and he used his influence to persuade Don Antonio to cooperate with Francesca and Sofia. Antonio, shaken by Lorenzo's death and the subsequent chaos within the De Luca family, had begun to realize the futility of the ongoing conflict. He saw the devastation it had caused, the lives it had destroyed, and he was finally willing to consider a different path. He agreed to meet with Francesca, a secret rendezvous arranged by Marco and Sofia. It was a tense and emotional meeting, filled with years of mistrust and animosity, but also with a shared grief and a mutual desire for peace. Francesca presented the evidence against Sal DeMarco, laying out the case for his removal and the need for a united front against his ambition. She spoke of Lorenzo's sacrifice, his dream of a future free from violence, his unwavering love for her. Antonio listened, his expression softening, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and understanding. He saw in Francesca a strength and determination that mirrored his own, a woman who had been forged in the fires of adversity, a woman who was willing to fight for what she believed in. He agreed to support her plan, to work with her and Sofia to bring down Sal DeMarco, and to establish a lasting peace between their families. It was a tentative alliance, fragile and fraught with challenges, but it was a step in the right direction. Beneath the surface of the simmering conflict, a new alliance was forming, a coalition of unlikely allies united by grief, by a desire for justice, and by a shared hope for a better future. Francesca, Sofia, Marco, and even Don Antonio were working together, their masks discarded, their true selves revealed, their hearts set on a common goal, to end the cycle of violence and to honor the memory of the man who had sacrificed everything for peace. The meeting place, shrouded in secrecy, became a symbol of hope, the silence filled with the whispers of reconciliation, the darkness illuminated by the flickering flame of a new beginning. Chapter 18. A Flame in the Darkness. With the combined forces of Francesca, Sofia, Marco, and Don Antonio aligned against him, Sal DeMarco's position began to crumble. The other mafia families, sensing his weakness and fearing his instability, withdrew their support, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. Francesca orchestrated a daring plan to expose Sal's treachery and bring him to justice. She used her knowledge of the De Luca organization, her contacts within the underworld, and her own cunning to gather irrefutable evidence of his crimes. She discovered that Sal had been embezzling funds from the De Luca family for years, siphoning off millions of dollars to offshore accounts. He had also been involved in several murders, eliminating rivals and silencing anyone who threatened his power. Francesca presented this evidence to the heads of the other mafia families, a council of dons who governed the underworld with a strict code of honor and justice. She laid out the case against Sal DeMarco, detailing his betrayal of the De Lucas, his involvement in Lorenzo's death, and his numerous other crimes. The dons, initially skeptical of Francesca, were swayed by the overwhelming evidence and by the impassioned pleas of Sofia and Marco. They saw in Francesca a woman of courage and determination, a woman who was fighting for justice, for peace, for a better future. They condemned Sal DeMarco's actions, declaring him an enemy of the mafia, a traitor who deserved the ultimate punishment. They issued a decree, a death sentence, ordering his capture and execution. Sal, realizing that his power had evaporated and his life was in danger, went into hiding. He surrounded himself with a small group of loyal followers, mercenaries, and assassins who were willing to fight to the death to protect him. Francesca, knowing that Sal wouldn't surrender without a fight, prepared for a final confrontation. She gathered her allies, a small but determined force of Barone and De Luca loyalists who were committed to ending the conflict and bringing Sal to justice. They tracked Sal to an abandoned warehouse on the waterfront, a desolate and dangerous location that served as his last stand. They knew that it would be a bloody battle, a fight to the death, but they were prepared to risk everything to achieve their goal. As they approached the warehouse, the night air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the lapping of the waves against the pilings and the distant sounds of the city. They moved stealthily, their weapons drawn, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. They breached the warehouse, entering a darkened space filled with shadows and the scent of decay. A firefight erupted, the air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the flashes of muzzle blasts illuminating the darkness. Francesca fought with a fierce determination, her movements precise and deadly. She had trained with Marco, honing her skills, preparing for this moment. She was no longer the sheltered mafia princess, she was a warrior, fighting for justice, for revenge, for the memory of the man she loved. The battle raged, the forces evenly matched, the outcome uncertain. Francesca saw her allies fall, their lives sacrificed in the pursuit of peace. She saw Sal DeMarco, his face contorted with rage and desperation, fighting with a brutal ferocity. She faced him, her gun trained on him, her finger tightening on the trigger. It was a moment of truth, a moment of reckoning, a moment that would determine the future of their families. But in that moment, amidst darkness and the threat of death, she made a decision. Chapter 19. The Reckoning. Francesca stood face to face with Sal DeMarco, her gun trained on him, her finger hovering over the trigger. The warehouse echoed with the sounds of the dying battle, the groans of the wounded, the last gasps of those who had fallen. Sal glared at her, his eyes filled with hatred and defiance. "You think you've won, Barone?" he sneered. "You think you can defeat me?" Francesca met his gaze unflinchingly. "It's over, Sal," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You've lost. Your ambition, your greed, your thirst for power, it's all come to nothing." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the desolate space. "You're a fool, Francesca. You're just like Lorenzo. Weak. Sentimental. You don't have what it takes to survive in this world." His words stung, but Francesca didn't flinch. She had made her decision. She wouldn't kill him. She wouldn't stoop to his level. She wouldn't perpetuate the cycle of violence that had plagued their families for generations. "I'm not like Lorenzo," she said, her voice steady.
I'm stronger.
"I've learned from his mistakes. I've learned that violence is not the answer. Revenge is not the solution." She lowered her gun, her finger releasing the trigger. Sal stared at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and disbelief. What are you doing?"
He stammered.
"I'm ending this," Francesca said. "I'm breaking the cycle. I'm choosing a different path." She turned to the remaining combatants, her voice ringing out through the warehouse. "It's over," she declared. "Lay down your weapons. This war is finished." The men, exhausted and demoralized, hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But they saw the conviction in Francesca's eyes, the authority in her voice, and they obeyed. They lowered their guns, surrendering to her, to the promise of peace. Sal, disarmed and defeated, was taken into custody by the remaining loyal DeLuca men, his reign of terror brought to an end. He would face the judgment of the other mafia families, his fate sealed by his own treachery. Francesca, surrounded by her allies, surveyed the scene, her heart heavy with grief for the lives lost, but also filled with a sense of relief, of accomplishment, of hope. The battle was over. The war was won. But the true reckoning was yet to come. Francesca knew that ending the violence was only the first step. Building a lasting peace would require forgiveness, reconciliation, and a willingness to overcome the deep-seated mistrust and animosity that had defined their families for so long. She reached out to Sophia, who had been injured in the battle, but was recovering. She reached out to Marco, who had risked everything to help her, to support her, to believe in her. She reached out to Don Antonio, who had finally seen the error of his ways and was ready to embrace a new path. Together, they began the difficult process of healing, of rebuilding, of forging a new future. They established a council, a forum for dialogue and cooperation, a place where the Baroness and the DeLucas could work together to resolve their differences, to build a lasting peace. It was a long and arduous process, filled with challenges and setbacks, but they persevered. They honored Lorenzo's memory by working tirelessly to achieve his dream, a world free from violence, a world where love could conquer hate, where families could be united, not divided. The warehouse, once a symbol of death and destruction, became a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of resilience, and the enduring possibility of peace. The reckoning had come, not in the form of revenge, but in the form of redemption, a transformation born from grief and fueled by a determination to build a better future. Chapter 20. A New Dawn. The months that followed were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of forgiveness, and the enduring hope for a better future. Francesca, Sofia, Marco, and Don Antonio worked tirelessly to build bridges between the Barone and De Luca families, to heal the wounds of the past, and to establish a lasting peace. The council they had established became a forum for dialogue, a place where old grievances could be aired, where misunderstandings could be resolved, and where new alliances could be forged. It was a slow and often difficult process, but they persevered, driven by their commitment to Lorenzo's memory and their shared desire for a future free from violence. They implemented new rules, new codes of conduct that emphasized cooperation, respect, and a commitment to non-violent conflict resolution. They established joint ventures, business partnerships that benefited both families, creating a sense of shared purpose and mutual prosperity. They also worked to address the underlying causes of the conflict, the deep-seated mistrust and animosity that had fueled the decades-long feud. They organized social events, community gatherings, opportunities for the members of both families to interact, to get to know each other, to break down the barriers that had separated them for so long. Francesca, despite her grief over Lorenzo's death, emerged as a strong and respected leader. She had inherited his charisma, his intelligence, and his unwavering commitment to peace. She became a bridge between the two families, a voice of reason, a symbol of hope. Sofia, recovered from her injuries, continued to be a wise and influential advisor, her experience and her deep connections within the mafia world proving invaluable. Marco, having proven his loyalty and his commitment to peace, became a trusted leader within the Barone family, working closely with his father to implement the new reforms. Don Antonio, transformed by his experiences, had become a staunch advocate for peace. He had finally recognized the futility of the violence, the devastation it had caused, and he was determined to make amends for the mistakes of the past. He publicly apologized for his role in the conflict, expressing his remorse for the lives lost and the pain inflicted. The other mafia families, witnessing the transformation of the Baroness and the DeLucas, were inspired by their example. They saw the benefits of cooperation, the strength of unity, and the possibility of a future free from the constant threat of war. They began to adopt similar reforms, implementing new rules and codes of conduct that emphasized peace and nonviolence. The underworld, once a place of darkness and violence, was slowly but surely transforming into a place of cooperation and mutual respect. The old ways were fading, replaced by a new order, a new dawn of peace and prosperity. Francesca, standing on the balcony of the rebuilt De Luca mansion, overlooking the city that had once been a battleground, felt a sense of profound peace. The air was clear, the sky was bright, and the city lights twinkled like stars, reflecting the hope that had been rekindled in her heart. She had lost Lorenzo, but she had found something precious in his absence, a purpose, a mission, a legacy to uphold. She had honored his memory by building the future he had dreamed of, a future where love could conquer hate, where families could be united, where peace could prevail. A new dawn had broken, not just for the Baroness and the DeLucas, but for the entire underworld. It was a dawn of hope, of healing, of reconciliation. It was a dawn that had been purchased at a great price, but it was a dawn that was worth fighting for. And Francesca, standing tall and strong, was ready to embrace it, to build a brighter future for all. The city stretched before her, a testament to resilience, a symbol of hope, a promise of a new beginning. Epilogue. Years passed. The scars of the past remained, a reminder of the pain and loss that had been endured, but they were no longer open wounds. They were marks of resilience, symbols of survival, testaments to the strength of the human spirit. The Barone and DeLuca families, once sworn enemies, had become allies, their bond forged in the fires of adversity and strengthened by their shared commitment to peace. The council they had established continued to thrive, a forum for cooperation, a symbol of unity, a beacon of hope for the future. Francesca, now a respected leader within the mafia world, had never remarried. Her heart belonged to Lorenzo, and his memory lived on in everything she did. She dedicated her life to building a better future, to ensuring that the violence and hatred of the past would never return. She often visited the small, quiet cemetery where Lorenzo was buried. She would sit beside his grave, sharing her thoughts, her dreams, her accomplishments. She would tell him about the progress they had made, the peace they had achieved, the legacy he had left behind. One spring afternoon, as she sat beside his grave, the sun warm on her face, the air filled with the scent of blossoms, she felt a sense of profound peace. She had kept her promise. She had honored his memory. She had built the future he had dreamed of. She looked up at the sky, a clear, bright blue that stretched endlessly above her. She imagined him there, watching over her, smiling down on her, proud of what she had accomplished. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, a whisper of his presence, a reassurance that he was still with her, in spirit, in memory, in the love that would endure forever. She smiled, a bittersweet smile filled with both sadness and hope. She had lost him, but she had found herself. She had found her purpose, her strength, her voice. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her dress, and turned to leave. As she walked away, she felt a sense of closure, of acceptance, of peace. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking display of beauty and serenity. It was a new day, a new beginning, a new chapter in her life. And Francesca, walking tall and strong, was ready to embrace it, to continue building a better future, to honor the memory of the man she loved, to live a life filled with purpose, with passion, with peace. The cemetery, once a place of grief, had become a place of remembrance, a symbol of hope, a testament to the enduring power of love. And as she walked away, she knew that Lorenzo's spirit would always be with her, guiding her, protecting her, inspiring her to continue the fight for a better world. A world he envisioned, and one she now helped create. The end.